Imagine this. You wake up, it's dark, and you hear electrical sockets popping. Then you realize there's water, ankle deep, already in your home. That was the reality for Christopher Flowers in Kerr County, Texas, just this past July. He had to scramble, get 9 family members up into the attic, fast. Outside, these incredibly swift, destructive floodwaters were just tearing through before sunrise. So many people were caught, completely off guard. The human cost, it was just devastating. We know at least 43 people died. And horrifically, 27 girls from a summer camp near the river are still missing. And in the aftermath, you had local officials facing really intense questions about the warnings. Could they have come sooner? Being clearer. This whole terrible event, it isn't just a news story. It really throws into sharp relief the big questions we're tackling today about disaster preparedness and response. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack these proposed really major changes to how the federal government handles disasters. This includes President Trump's announcement about phasing out FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and shifting that aid role directly to the White House. Now, to do this, we've gathered several key sources. We've got a recent news report right from Texas covering the floods and the immediate political reactions. We also have an analysis looking specifically at these proposed federal policy shifts. And really importantly, we have the comprehensive 2023 National Preparedness Report from FEMA itself. Gives us that baseline picture.
Right. And our mission today really is to explore what these big proposed changes actually mean for the country. How do they connect to FEMA's own history, its evolution, its current capabilities? And, what are the potential challenges, maybe even opportunities that these shifts present for disaster readiness in every community?
Okay, let's unpack this. That shocking reality in Texas, as you said, it really isn't just a headline. It feels like a stark illustration of the urgent questions we need to ask about how we prepare, how we respond. So let's delve deeper into those Texas floods first, because they really do serve as this kind of powerful microcosm for our national challenges. The water in the Texas Hill Country, it came up so fast before sunrise, just caught so many people completely unaware. Now, official warnings did go out. There was an initial flood watch Thursday afternoon, 1:18 p.m., predicting maybe 5 to 7 inches of rain. But then the alerts got, as the reports say, increasingly ominous early Friday morning. And that culminated in this really urgent warning about catastrophic damage, severe threat to life at 4:03 a.m.
And what's fascinating here, or perhaps troubling, is how those immediate challenges in Texas really put a spotlight on this whole preparedness discussion. You had local officials like Kerr County Judge Rob Kelly and Kerrville City Manager Dalton Rice basically saying nobody saw this coming. They described the intensity as, quote, equivalent of months' worth of rain. Rice also made an interesting point that the public can sometimes get desensitized if there are too many warnings.
That's always a tricky balance, isn't it? Alert fatigue.
It is. But then you have the public scrutiny and expert voices, too. U.S. Representative Chip Roy, he acknowledged there was finger-pointing. And AccuWeather's chief meteorologist, Jonathan Porter, he suggested that, evacuations and other proactive steps could have been undertaken regardless of exactly how much rain was forecast. It just puts everything under the microscope.
And it adds another layer when you learn that Kerr County had actually considered a flood warning siren system maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But they didn't move forward because of the cost. The report mentioned the public reeled at the price tag back then.
Yeah, hindsight is always 20/20, but it's a tough detail in light of what happened. You also had other things happening, like a drone colliding with a rescue helicopter during the search efforts, which just shows the complexity.
Right. And local sports teams stepped up. The Rockets, Mavericks, Spurs donated over $2 million for relief, which is great to see.
And Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem commented too, saying forecasters do have difficulty predicting exact rainfall totals. She mentioned the Trump administration prioritizes upgrading what she called neglected National Weather Service technology.
Okay, so that Texas situation really sets the stage. It highlights the immediate life and death stakes involved in disaster response. Now let's connect that to the bigger picture, this plan to reshape federal disaster response.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how those immediate challenges we see in Texas connect directly to this much larger discussion about the future of federal disaster response and the very role of FEMA itself.
So the administration announced they plan to start phasing out FEMA once this current hurricane season is over. And President Trump's reasoning, as stated, is that he's long seen FEMA as, quote, ineffective and unnecessary.
Yeah.
The proposed new system, federal disaster aid, would come straight from the White House, just bypass the agency altogether.
Right. But here's where it gets complicated. This isn't just about what the president wants to do via, say, an executive order. FEMA's core functions, its structure, its obligations, a lot of that is actually written into federal law by Congress. Specifically, you can look at 6 U.S.C. 316. Think of it like a statutory safeguard. Congress has explicitly said the head of Homeland Security cannot substantially or significantly reduce FEMA's authorities or capabilities.
So they can't just dismantle it easily.
Not without Congress changing the law, no. FEMA operates under DHS, Department of Homeland Security. It was set up way back in '79, and its roles are critical, coordinating supplies, shelter, running the National Flood Insurance Program. These are big, established functions defined by law.
That's a really powerful point about the legal framework. It basically means Congress has to be involved for any fundamental change, like a phase-out. So if the president's plan faces these significant legal hurdles, what does that mean practically for, states and local communities who depend on this system now?
Well, it raises huge questions. Ed Emmett, he's a former Harris County judge and now a fellow at Rice University, he pointed this out. He said there are just critical questions unanswered, like who's going to handle the temporary housing, who's providing the meals, the water, the ice after a storm, and crucially, who pays for all of that?
Right, the money question.
Exactly. Emmett said while he has confidence in Texas officials, like their emergency management director, W. Nim Kidd, he stressed, quote, there needs to be a plan if you're going to eliminate FEMA. You can't just throw it out there and hope that that happens. He did acknowledge FEMA hasn't been perfect. He mentioned outdated flood maps in his own county years after Hurricane Harvey, inefficient housing programs.
Sure, FEMA's faced criticism before.
Absolutely. But Emmett emphasized that despite flaws, its functions are still crucial. You can't just eliminate them without a replacement.
Okay, but then you have Texas Governor Greg Abbott offering a very different perspective. His office put out a statement saying, basically, Texas is ready. They believe Texas has built the strongest emergency management operation in the nation. He expressed full confidence that TDM, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, can swiftly take action. And he said he intends to keep bringing Texas's proven leadership to this new FEMA Review Council to make sure state and local governments are, quote, empowered to better serve their citizens.
It's a strong statement of state capability.
It is. But thinking back to what we were just discussing from the FEMA report, those national gaps in individual preparedness, the inconsistencies in building codes across the country, how does this asserted state-level strength really mesh with those broader national vulnerabilities?
That's the key tension, isn't it? I mean, a state can have a fantastic program, absolutely. But the federal framework, FEMA, it's designed partly as that backstop for the truly massive disasters, the ones that overwhelm even well-prepared states or cross multiple state lines. And the reactions from local governments in Texas to this proposed federal change were, well, they were mixed. Some places, like Missouri City, basically said, we're equipped to respond. They talked about their local emergency operations center, mutual aid agreements with neighbors, using the state's TDM assistance system, the STAR system if needed. They feel they can handle it, and they train continuously, quote, with or without federal aid.
So confident in their state and local setup.
Right. Fort Bend County expressed similar trust in the governor and TDM. But others, like the emergency services chief in Chambers County, expressed more uncertainty. He said he wasn't sure what the actual impact would be without a clear plan from the federal level. He noted they have strong communication with TDM, the state agency. And he said, look, if the governor and TDM were tasked with the role of FEMA and were provided with proper funding, they'd do their very best. So he wasn't panicked, but he emphasized the need for adequate planning and a structured transition. Basically, we trust our state partners, but we need to know the details of this federal shift.
Okay, so we've looked at the immediate impact in Texas. We've looked at this proposed massive federal shakeup, the legal questions, the state reactions. But to really get our heads around the gravity of all this, we need to zoom out even further. And that's where FEMA's own 2023 National Preparedness Report comes in. It gives us this crucial data-driven perspective on where the nation actually stands in terms of readiness. And some of what it reveals is pretty stark.
It really is. Let's just put some numbers on this to get a sense of the scale. Between January 2020 and December 2022, just 3 years, the U.S. experienced 60 separate climate-related disasters. 60. And each one of those cost at least $1 billion in damages.
Wow. $60 billion disasters in 3 years.
Yeah. And those events caused nearly 1,500 deaths and almost 3,000 injuries. 2022 alone had 18 such events, costing $165 billion, making it the third costliest year on record. 474 deaths just in that year from those events.
That's an incredible acceleration. It paints a picture that our current systems, maybe they weren't really designed for this frequency, this intensity.
Exactly. The system is clearly strained. FEMA itself, the report notes, managed 71 major disaster declarations in 2023. That's more than double the 30 they handled back in 2016. And the number of FEMA responders deployed on any given day has also doubled since 2017. The report really highlights some key preparedness gaps across the board. In 2022, for instance, communities were asked what threats they thought were most likely. They said cyber attacks, pandemics, and floods. And when asked what threats would most stress their capabilities, same top 2 cyber attacks and pandemics, but then earthquakes swapped in for floods. So there's an awareness of these major risks.
But awareness doesn't always equal action, right? It's not just about what local governments are doing or worried about. Individual preparedness is a huge piece of this puzzle. And FEMA's 2022 National Household Survey had some frankly concerning findings. It found that 42% of people surveyed said they plan to prepare for disasters in the future, but they just haven't started yet.
42% haven't started.
Yeah, and another 14% said they don't intend to prepare at all. And look at this trend. The percentage of adults who said they took 3 or more basic preparedness actions, like having supplies, making a plan that dropped to 55% in 2022. It was 68% just 2 years earlier in 2020.
That's a big drop.
It is. And people's self-assessment of how prepared they felt, that dropped too, from 59% feeling prepared in 2019 down to just 45% in 2022.
The pandemic likely played a role in those shifts. Resource fatigue, maybe.
Probably. But the bottom line is, it shows this worrying trend of declining personal readiness right when the threats seem to be getting worse.
And that decline in personal readiness is compounded by gaps we see at the community level, particularly in funding priorities. The report shows that while federal grant investments are pretty high in some general areas like cross-cutting capabilities, protection, response, they are notably low in some really critical recovery areas. Things like long-term housing solutions, protecting natural and cultural resources after a disaster, mass care services for survivors, and crucially, logistics and supply chain management.
So the money isn't necessarily going where the long-term recovery needs are greatest?
It seems that way. And not only are investments lower in those areas, but the report also shows lower achievement of preparedness targets in those same areas. So we're underinvesting and underperforming in key recovery functions. And then there's this huge disconnect on building codes. We know the data is clear. Adopting and enforcing modern building codes is probably the single most cost-effective thing communities can do to reduce risk, save lives, save money in the long run.
Makes sense. Build stronger from the start.
Exactly. Yet the report found that 2 out of every 3 communities in the U.S. have not adopted the latest disaster-resistant building codes.
2 out of 3. Wow.
Yeah. Responsibility for codes is decentralized, falls to state, local, tribal, territorial governments. So you get this huge variation. Lots of older infrastructure, especially in the Midwest, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, is built to much lower standards, making it really vulnerable. And the benefits of modern codes are tangible. They estimate modern codes can save homeowners about $162 a year on utility bills, and nationally, they could prevent an average of $1.6 billion in hazard damages annually.
So we're basically choosing not to make these savings and safety improvements in most places.
That seems to be the case. It's actively building in vulnerability for the future.
And the report also highlights the social vulnerability aspect, which is so important. It points out that high-risk areas aren't just about geography, like the western U.S. facing wildfires, earthquakes, floods that strain housing and relocation. It's also concentrated in the South, the Midwest, Florida, Hawaii, dealing with hurricanes, tornadoes, severe weather. But critically, the data shows disasters hit socially vulnerable populations the hardest. People already facing challenges like poverty, lack of transportation access, language barriers, they suffer disproportionately.
Absolutely. It magnifies existing inequalities.
FEMA's 2023 National Climate Resiliency Framework actually defines resilience pretty broadly. It's the ability to prepare for threats and hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from adverse conditions and disruptions.
That definition really emphasizes being proactive, adaptable, which seems, well, maybe a bit at odds with some of the proposed federal changes that introduce uncertainty.
Right. So given everything we've just laid out from the FEMA report, the increasing disasters, the strain system, the preparedness gaps, the vulnerabilities, the really critical question becomes, How might these proposed federal changes, the FEMA phase-out idea, the direct White House aid, how might that impact the very capabilities the report tells us we need most? First, let's just quickly circle back to the legality we touched on.
As we said, the president likely cannot just abolish FEMA or unilaterally gut its core duties defined by Congress through an executive order. Those orders mainly guide how agencies implement laws Congress has already passed. Plus, there's the Stafford Act. That's the main federal disaster law. It requires federal assistance to be provided in an equitable and impartial manner. The president can't just tack on unrelated conditions, like telling a state they only get aid if they change their, say, water policies or forestry management or voter ID laws, as has been floated in some contexts. That could run into major constitutional problems, issues with due process for survivors.
So, significant legal guardrails exist, theoretically. But then there's the practical reality of what's already happening. You mentioned the FEMA Review Council earlier. President Trump's Executive Order 14180 set that up back in January 2025. It's meant to advise on changing the agency. It's led by the Secretaries of Homeland Security and Defense, includes appointed Republican members of Congress. It formally kicked off in February 2025. Around the same time, just days after that EO, FEMA disbanded its National Advisory Council, the NAC.
Right, and the NAC was different. Congress actually established it after Katrina specifically to get advice into FEMA from state, local, tribal, private sector experts with transparency requirements. So replacing that broad council with this new, more politically appointed council is a definite shift.
And the executive order establishing the new council, the source analysis notes, repeats what it calls false claims about political bias in FEMA, and the agency supposedly spending well over $1 billion to welcome illegal aliens.
Yeah, that language certainly signals a highly politicized approach.
So what are the real-world effects on FEMA's ability to just do its job when its structure, its funding, even its perceived impartiality are being challenged like this?
Well, it creates huge instability, for one, and it risks undermining public trust, which is absolutely essential in an emergency. People need to trust the information and the aid coming from the government. This politicization also seems to be directly impacting the workforce and resources. There were reports of over 200 probationary FEMA employees being fired shortly after the administration took office. This included the agency's chief financial officer. They were labeled non-mission critical personnel by DHS.
Firing the CFO sounds pretty critical.
You'd think so. And this happened when FEMA already had a staffing gap estimated around 20%, so they were already short-staffed.
Wow.
And there are reports of plans for more cuts, possibly targeting staff who worked on things like climate resilience, environmental justice, or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, areas that were actually priorities under FEMA's previous strategic plan.
So a real shift in focus and personnel.
Seems like it. And beyond staffing, there's the funding piece. Remember Ed Emmett's question, who pays? Funding for the Legal Services Corporation, LSC, that's the group that supports nonprofit legal aid for low-income disaster survivors, crucial help often called the third responders, after the immediate emergency crews.
Yeah, helping with insurance claims, housing issues.
Exactly. That funding was apparently left out of an emergency supplemental spending bill in December 2024. And that's significant because LSC disaster funding had been included in every major disaster package since Hurricane Sandy back in 2012.
So pulling back on legal help for survivors right when disasters are increasing.
It appears so. These aren't just small adjustments. They look like systemic challenges to some core functions of disaster recovery.
And then there's another move that seems to roll back resilience efforts, the non-enforcement of certain regulations. Our sources mentioned that FEMA's chief counsel put out a memo in February 2025, essentially pausing enforcement of a rule finalized during the Biden administration. It was called the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, or FFRMS.
Right, the FFRMS. That was a big deal.
What did it do exactly?
Basically, it required that any federally funded infrastructure projects, think roads, hospitals, fire stations built with federal money, had to be designed and built considering future flood risks, including climate change projections, not just historical flood data.
So trying to build smarter in flood-prone areas using federal dollars.
Precisely. Protecting taxpayer investments and critical facilities. The memo, pausing its enforcements, stated the goal was to allow time for it to be potentially rescinded or revised. But legally, you can't just pause a finalized rule like that indefinitely without going through a formal rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedure Act. So it creates a lot of legal uncertainty and, in the meantime, potentially allows projects to be built to lower, less resilient standards in flood zones.
Okay, so we have potential legal fights, a new review council, staffing cuts, funding questions, paused regulations. It's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of uncertainty injected into the system.
Exactly. So now let's try to connect these dots. Given all these factors, how could these proposed changes impact those specific core capabilities that FEMA's own 2023 report flagged as critical or already challenged? Let's start with fire management and suppression. The report highlighted increasing wildfire threats, remember. 9 out of 10 are human-caused. They caused $3.1 billion in damages in 2022 alone. And the areas where homes meet wildlands, the WUI, are expanding rapidly.
Right, more people living in high-risk fire zones.
Exactly. The report identified existing gaps in things like firefighting equipment inventories, staffing levels for firefighters, and effective warning tools for communities. Grant investments in this area were also noted as declining. So if federal support through FEMA is reduced or becomes less predictable, or if coordination falters, these existing gaps could get much wider, leaving more communities dangerously exposed, especially without stronger building codes and more community collaboration.
Okay, what about logistics and supply chain management? Getting supplies where they need to go, that sounds fundamental.
Absolutely critical. And the report pointed to real vulnerabilities here already. Things like climate impacts, remember the Mississippi River drought that grounded supply barges?
Yeah, that was huge.
Aging infrastructure ports, railways, roads, and just a national shortage of warehouse space to pre-position supplies. The report also flagged gaps in logistics training, staff capacity, and even domestic production of essential goods.
So if the federal coordination role provided by FEMA is dismantled or significantly altered.
It could seriously exacerbate these problems. Getting food, water, medicine, building materials into a disaster zone could become much harder, much slower. It really underscores why sustained federal investment in things like ports and clear guidance on adapting infrastructure to sea level rise are so vital.
And then there's public health, healthcare, and emergency medical services, obviously critical in any disaster.
Hugely. And the threats are increasing here too. We saw the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic continuing into 2022, the Mpox outbreak. Plus, there are emerging infectious diseases, and climate change is making some chronic illnesses worse. Think heat stress, respiratory problems from wildfire smoke.
And the healthcare system itself is strained.
Deeply strained. Persistent staffing shortages, clinician burnout, and hospitals are increasingly targets of cyber attacks, which can cripple their operations. So reliable federal support for building healthcare capacity, funding training exercises, ensuring the resilience of the medical supply chain, it's absolutely vital. Any reduction or confusion in that federal role could turn a natural disaster into an even worse public health catastrophe.
Okay, one more key area from the report, long-term vulnerability reduction. This is about building resilience before the disaster hits, right?
Yep.
Mitigation.
Exactly. Strengthening communities and infrastructure over the long haul. The report actually showed high target achievement in this area, which sounds good, but the scale of the challenge remains immense. Think about the impacts of massive winter storms like that Arctic blast in December 2022 that caused nearly 100 deaths and widespread power outages, or extreme heat, which kills hundreds of people annually and strains our power grids. Inland flooding is a growing problem too.
And we already talked about the inconsistent building codes.
Right. And our aging energy infrastructure, 70% of the U.S. power grid is over 25 years old. These are major hurdles to long-term resilience.
So federal support is key here.
It's essential. Federal grants, technical assistance, coordinated efforts, these are crucial for helping state, local, tribal, and territorial governments make progress on mitigation and resilience. They often lack the resources, the funding, the personnel to tackle these huge long-term infrastructure challenges on their own. Disrupting that established federal role, especially without a clear and well-funded alternative, could really slow down or even reverse progress on making the nation fundamentally safer from future climate impacts.
So wrapping this up, we've really taken a deep dive today. We started with that immediate, devastating impact of the Texas floods and connected it to these really significant proposed policy shifts at the federal level, looking at the potential dismantling of FEMA. And we've grounded it all in the data, in the realities outlined in the national preparedness landscape from FEMA's own report.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaways are pretty clear. First, disasters driven largely by climate change are undeniably growing in frequency, severity, and cost. That's just the reality we face. This underscores more than ever the need for a really robust, well-coordinated, and adequately resourced emergency management system. Not just response, but preparedness, recovery, mitigation, the whole cycle. And while individual states like Texas express confidence in their own readiness, and that's important, the comprehensive FEMA report reveals these persistent systemic gaps in preparedness across the country at the individual level, the community level, and across critical national capabilities.
And it's also clear that FEMA, as it exists now, wasn't just created on a whim. Its role, its structure, its legal obligations have evolved over decades, often in direct response to lessons learned from major disasters like Hurricane Katrina. So, proposing these fundamental changes, especially with unclear transition plans, potential legal challenges, and at a time when the existing system is already clearly strained by escalating disasters, well, it carries significant potential risks.
Right. The consequences of these policy decisions, whichever way they go, they're going to ripple out across every single community. They'll impact our collective ability to respond effectively when disaster strikes, to help survivors recover, and ultimately to build genuine long-term resilience against future threats.
So reflecting on all of this, what does it really mean for you listening right now?
Yeah.
As our country navigates this really complex landscape and evolving threat environment on one hand, and potential major shifts in how we prepare and respond on the other, how can you best engage?
It's not just about staying informed, though that's crucial. It's also about thinking critically, thinking about the collective effort that's required in your own community and across the nation to build that real resilience we talked about. So maybe the thought to leave you with is this. Beyond the basics, like having an emergency kit or a family plan, what unexpected areas of preparedness might be most important for you to consider next? Where are the less obvious vulnerabilities, maybe in your community's infrastructure or its social support systems, that need attention?